All right, next up we've got Oskar Fülöp. Hello.
Hey Christopher, nice to meet you.
You too. So tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, for the last 10 years I was a freelance art director in Germany, in Mannheim. And last year, based on HIVE, I started to learn Houdini.
Right on. So what are you going to be presenting on today?
Today I show a couple of simple steps to come up with a concept, because I'm from advertising and those things are quite important there. And afterwards I explain my thoughts on decision making and everything on a practical example based on an entry I did for the Mardini Sci-Fi entry.
Right on. Well, let's get started.
Great.
Hi everyone, welcome to my presentation. This is the table of content and there you can see what to expect in the next couple of minutes. First we start with concepts and then I explain to you why I'm so into priorities. Afterwards I talk about an idea generation method which is called Scamper. Then I show you quickly what my referencing tools look like and wrap everything up with my conclusion and personal experiences from the Mardini contest. Before we jump into Houdini, where I show you how I built the Sci-Fi building and the volume for the day 17 Sci-Fi entry. All right. So what sets a great project apart from a good one? It's concepts. And maybe you're thinking right now, come on, concepts. They make everything unnecessarily complicated. It's hard to get them running. I don't even know how to start with those. This is pretty much what I thought when I started in the industry. But today I know better and I know concept is basically the master plan for every decision everybody's gonna take, especially if you're working in a team. Okay, so what did change since then? Today I try to think in priorities. What I mean by that is plain or abstract evaluated information. Ideally, it's a list which tells you the order of importance. But why do I tell you these very basic things you already know? Because priorities basically are cheats. They're shortcuts. They're blueprints for a solution. It feels like cheating because you're starting the race from the finishing line. So by understanding them, you are way more likely to hit the target. Just only because of you know what's the ideal outcome. Therefore, you just have to adapt your further steps because you already know the outcome. So basically, priorities are shortcuts, which gives you a direction and the room to focus. And in my experience, priorities are the most crucial step and the groundwork for every strategy. And by strategy, I mean the order of execution, which includes creative parts, the idea generation, for instance. I scribbled down an exemplary process. We already talked about point 1 and 2, gather information and evaluation, which is basically the priority part. And we are now by the creative mambo jumbo, which represents an interchangeable idea generation method. In my case, I picked the Scamper method. There are literally hundreds of creative idea generation techniques and they differ a lot. Feel free to use whatever you like to. This one is named Scamper and it's one of the most known. Scamper is an acronym and it stands for substitute, combine, adapt, modify, magnify, minify, put to other use, eliminate, rearrange. And if you want to use them, you have to lay out all your gathered information / priorities and pair them with these verbs. And hopefully you find interesting connection or properties. I used this technique in the Mardini contest as well, and this is what I came up with. For the run entry, I substituted the horse's material and made it out of cardboard. For the wave entry on day 11, I combined the icon of the overall contest, the martini glass, with the day's challenge of the liquefied wave. With the rural entry, I minified a couple of objects and picked an interesting camera angle. The last example is the body part negation of this character for the wind entry. So let's move on to the tools I use for referencing. I made a PureRef pinboard for every entry, and therefore for collecting the images I mostly use Pinterest, followed by ArtStation and a bit of Google image search. Okay, now we arrived in the last block of my presentation. It's my conclusion of the Mardini contest and my learnings out of it. So A daily art contest is the most efficient way to learn Houdini. 100% true. There are only two possible workflows, the right one or the fast one. Accept your speed of learning and focus on iterations. You are only as good as your reference, everybody knows that. And the last 10% of the work can be 90% of the time. Okay, I guess we arrived at the end. The next thing I'm doing is I jump into Houdini and I'm gonna show you how I build the buildings and the fog of this rendering. Starting with the buildings. Okay, see ya! To model one of these buildings, I started with a box. Make it a mesh and give it a reasonable size. 20 by 80 by 20 meters seems fine. This is for getting rid of the unnecessary divisions. Now I'm defining the floor height. I use 4 meters by referencing the Y size. And doing the same with the center, centers the whole cube down. Even if I scale it upwards or downwards, you can see the floor size will stay the same. Now I want to ring select every second floor. To do so, I use the sort node and change the primitive sort by Y. The group range node gives me the pattern I'm looking for by selecting every 4 out of 8 primitives. If the top or bottom parts are also selected, just change the offset and get rid of those selections. To speed things up, I'm using the radial menu by pressing the C key. Notice that I'm in the modeling interface, which means our quick selections are related to modeling tasks. I simply pick the poly extrude node, and after assigning the right groups to it, it's basically playing around and looking for interesting shapes. I'm gonna speed up the video a bit, because from here I'm repeating the process of selecting, extruding and insetting until I'm fine with my base mesh. In this stage I'm adding elements to block out an overall form I'm happy with. I don't care about details yet, since later on we're going to have some shape breakups with the box cutter or Boolean workflow. And it's a good idea to change your perspective and look after your overall proportions from time to time. And finally, I'm happy with my base mesh and we can move on. First, I want to bevel the outside edges. And once again, the radial menu has you covered. Just pick and select the poly bevel node and it will drop down for you automatically. And of course, you can choose your fillet shape and subdivision amount as you please. I'm going with a round fillet and 5 subdivisions. It's always a good idea to tidy up your scene, name things out and keep it organized. From here, I'm adding shape breakups. To do so, I'm using the lab's box cutter workflow, which is basically an interactive Boolean. To use it, you just click and drag into a surface to drag out a rectangle. Then you hold down Control to add depth to it. A cool thing about the box cutter is the possibility to add some duplicates and transform them individually. To lock in the cutout, you just simply press A on your keyboard and you see the blue bounding boxes are gone now. To make them live again, you just simply drop down the cutout settings and click Make Live. Now you see the blue bounding boxes are back again. From here, you can make changes as you please. For example, I'm beveling the edges here. And if you want to be more precise about it, you can enable snapping options like grid snapping or surface snapping. If you're happy with your result, just lock in your cutout and add another layer. Once again, I'm speeding up the video here because it's a bit repetitive. I'm just blocking out some cutouts and looking after the overall shape of my tower. Another cool thing about the box cutter is its handling of the cutouts. They're all stored inside one node. And if you want to modify one cutout, you just simply make it live again and you're good to go. But one last final thing, since we're doing a sci-fi building, it has to have an antenna. To do so, I just simply select with the S key the bottom of this tube and use the insert function of the poly extrude to make the radius smaller. Then I add another poly extrude on top of it and crank up the distance to extrude it outwards. From here I'm pretty happy right now and we can stop. After such a manual approach, I should show you a more production-ready and procedural way of dealing with these tasks to demonstrate Houdini's real power. But for now, we stick to our priorities and keep going. Great, so this is basically the workflow I used to come up with these buildings in the original Sci-Fi rendering. Later on I used them multiple times with different scales and angles. For layout purposes I also generated a road network. These roads were more or less a visual help, since I used them to place the buildings more plausible. Great, so after working out my camera position and angle based on the roads, I started to place down the buildings to my liking. From reference I can tell architectural and aerial photography is mostly done with wider lenses, so I decided to go with an 80mm lens. The next thing I want to show is how to generate the fog. First, we generate a geonode, dive inside and create a box. And give it a reasonable size and a positioning, because the box itself will contain the volume and therefore you don't want to see its sides from your screen. But if you're not sure about your composition, that's no problem. Later on you can make changes as well. Okay, I'm happy with my box positioning and scale, and now I drop down a volume node. Change the uniform sampling mode to by size and drop down a volume warp. For a better understanding, I drop down a volume slice and merge it with the volume warp, so we can see a bit more what's happening inside the volume warp. These steps are just for visualizing purposes, so they are not crucial in any way. I almost forgot to rename the volume to density so Houdini knows what we're up to, since density is a predefined global attribute. Now we dive inside the volume warp. And in there the first thing we do is to tell to use the cube as the container for the volume. By dropping down a relative to bounding box node and connecting the operator input 1, which is the volume itself, and the position. The gradient on the volume slide tells us that there's a fall off on the x-axis, but we need it on the y-axis. To tackle this, we use a vector to float and output only the second output, which is the y-axis. To break up the uniformity, we'll add a turbulent noise to it. Connect the position and you'll see we have some splats on our gradient and in the volume itself. By scaling down the frequency, you basically make the noise bigger. I punched in a couple of values which worked out for me, but keep in mind these will vary a lot depending on scene scale. To get more headroom, we are negating our turbulent noise before the addition. To do so, we use the negate node. Next, I want to modify the appearance of the fog itself. To do so, I use the fit range node. By changing its source min and max values, we can crank up the contrast to give the fog a more solid appearance. For a more hazy look, make sure your values are more interpolated and not that sharp. I use the complement node to flip the fog upside down. One of the last things I like to do is to drop down a multiply constant node. This comes in handy when you're about to shade your volume. I'm using Redshift and therefore it's very good to have a multiplicator to crank up the density just to iterate through your looks. When you're happy with your look, you can jump out of the volume warp and convert it to a VDP volume out of efficiency. If you want to change the resolution of your volume, click on the volume node and change the division size. Since we told the volume warp to use the box as a container, we can reposition it. I changed the position of the box because you saw the border on the right side and therefore the border of the fog. Alright, this sums up my presentation. I just wanted to say thank you to SideFX for having me and giving me the opportunity to talk here, and for everybody else who participated in the Mardini challenge, and I hope to see you soon in the next daily art challenge. So bye bye!